Welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, broadcasting on KSQD Santa Cruz 90.7 FM and live streaming at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist. According to information from the Child Mind Institute, anxiety disorders are the most common mental health disorders of childhood and adolescence. Nearly 1 in 3 adolescents, that means 32%, will meet criteria for an anxiety disorder by the age of 18. This number represents a steady increase that's been occurring since 2007 and is of growing concern. Different kinds of anxiety affects young people at different times in development. Phobias and separation anxiety affect primarily young children, while social anxiety develops later as peer relationships become more important. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, of those teens with anxiety, more than 1 in 3 will also have behavior problems, and about 1 in 3 will also have depression. Parents need to understand this growing risk and also need to keep in mind that their child or teen's anxiety disorder is not a sign of poor parenting. And it can be helpful for parents to learn to recognize the signs of anxiety, learn how to respond and provide support for your teen, and how to build a network of support. Today, we continue our 2-show series on teens and anxiety with part 2, focusing on the experience of parenting a teen with anxiety. With me today is Jenny Shane, the mother of a teenage son and a daughter who is now 20. Both of her kids suffer from moderate to severe anxiety. In our last episode, part 1 of this series, Jenny's daughter, Elena, shared her experience of having severe anxiety from childhood and throughout her teen years, and how she learned to cope and find her way to success in college. Elena's mom, Jenny, is here with us today to help us learn more about what it's like parenting teens with anxiety and what she's learned along the way. Also with us is local psychologist Sheila Siegel, who will shed more light on contributing factors, symptoms of anxiety, the role of parents, and local resources. We planned this interview well before the coronavirus outbreak, and we're now recording the show remotely under these new conditions. So we'll additionally discuss the impacts these conditions have had on Jenny's family, and Dr. Siegel will discuss some of the expected impacts on teens with pre-existing anxiety. I also want our listeners to know that given that we're all recording from our homes, you may hear some unexpected background noises. Stay with us and learn more about parenting teens with anxiety. Let me tell you more about my guests today. Jenny Shane has been a resident of the Bay Area since 1990, where she moved to take a job with the city of Sunnyvale. After her children were born, she switched to a part-time schedule as a casual manager so that she could better support her children. Both of Jenny's children have faced and still face significant anxiety and other mental health challenges. Jenny's approach has been to switch her focus from identifying what is wrong with her children to identifying the environment they need to thrive, and she has been an advocate in creating those environments. Jenny herself has a long personal history with major depression, which has both given her insight and empathy, and fed her drive to combat misconceptions about mental health. Also with me today is Dr. Sheila Siegel, a licensed clinical psychologist in Santa Cruz, California. She's been in private practice here in our community for over 20 years, specializing in working with teens, young adults, and families. Sheila focuses on a strengths-based approach to support clients with building their resilience in order to optimize their lives. Sheila's also been on the faculty of several psychology graduate programs, as well as a guest lecturer for undergraduate students at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Sheila integrates a variety of therapeutic modalities, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, and solution-focused therapy. Sheila collaborates with her clients and their support systems to help them gain traction to make progress toward their goals. Welcome. I'm so glad you're both here with me today.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you.
So I was thinking maybe we would start with you, Sheila, and just talk about what are these conditions we're calling anxiety so that people understand the different types?
Sure. And I know that we addressed these in more detail in the last show, and so I will be brief and just refer the listener back to the previous show as well if they'd like a little more depth. But overall, anxiety disorders develop from a real complex set of risk factors, including genetics, family history, brain chemistry, temperament, often referred to as personality, our social models, life stressors, and traumas. So there are a number of forms of anxiety disorders. Typically, we think about kind of 6 different categories. So very briefly, I'll zip through those. The first one being generalized anxiety disorder, which is a feeling of anxiety without a clear triggering event. To a point that it impacts our daily activities. Obsessive compulsive disorder, which is having excessive thoughts or obsessions, which then lead to repetitive behaviors, which are referred to as compulsions. Panic disorder is the third category, which is a type of anxiety that causes panic attacks, which are sudden feelings of terror when there's no immediate danger. The fourth category is post-traumatic stress disorder, often thought of as PTSD. So this is a condition that's triggered by a very terrifying event or trauma, either by directly experiencing it or witnessing it. The fifth category is social phobia, and that's a form of anxiety in which everyday social interactions can actually cause a deep fear of being judged or worry about potential embarrassment. So much so that often people then avoid social interaction or even the potential of a social interaction. And then lastly, just other forms of phobias. So a phobia is essentially defined as an excessive fear of an object or a situation. And the common denominator there with phobias is that anxiety is driving a need for control over what seems uncontrollable, and therefore we choose to avoid it.
Great. Thank you so much. That's a lot of information. So I kind of want to just come back to, you know, most high school and college students would say like they're stressed out, right? That's a pretty common statement. But, when we're talking about clinical anxiety, how would you distinguish that, say, from being like situationally or temporarily stressed out?
Sure. Well, of course, all of us experience stress and anxiety in our lives, and we know that a certain amount of stress can be helpful to motivate us towards performance. However, too much stress can be a real trigger for anxiety. Stress and anxiety can seem similar emotionally and physically, both create uneasiness, tension, headaches, high blood pressure, loss of sleep. They're very different, though, in their origin. Generally, stress is a response to an external cause, such as a deadline at school or having an argument with a friend, and it often will stop then once the situation has actually been resolved. Alternatively, anxiety is a person's specific internal reaction to stress, and therefore the origin is actually internal. So it's anxiety is characterized by a persistent feeling of worry or dread in situations that may not actually really be life threatening. Unlike stress, anxiety actually persists even after the concern has passed. And anxiety is an evidence when a person's reaction is way out of proportion to the threat involved.
Yeah, I do think the last show that we did, which was on mental health during this COVID conditions, and one of the big conversations was how to help people's nervous system reset. So you're kind of talking about anxiety being an inability or of the system to kind of reset despite the fact that conditions change, right?
Exactly.
So it's staying on high alert all the time.
Yes.
And so, what should people know about sort of the range of severity of symptoms that are kind of included? I know those many categories, but just give us an idea of sort of what that broad range looks like.
Sure. Well, especially for teens, it's tough in that teens have a wide variety of physical and emotional changes as they're growing. And so an anxiety disorder can actually be really difficult to spot. There are a lot of red flags that might just seem like usual teen struggles. or they might just kind of get chalked up to hormones. So parents can actually look for emotional, social, physical, sleep, and school performance changes. So for example, emotionally, some teens with anxiety will express feelings of pervasive worry. Others experience more subtle changes like feeling kind of keyed up or always on edge, irritability, difficulty concentrating, being super restless, or just kind of unexplained outbursts of frustration, right? The second area is in terms of social change, anxiety can really negatively impact friendships for teens. If your once social teen seems to become more avoidant of their favorite activities or stops making plans with friends, it's time to pay attention. Um, Third area, physical changes. Many of the physical complaints that can occur with anxiety mimic average teen complaints, which do tend to increase as they get older. The key is to pay attention to the patterns. A few headaches here and there may not be a big cause for concern. However, frequent headaches are a red flag. So some common physical changes might be GI, gastrointestinal problems, unexplained aches and pains chronically, excessive fatigue, or just complaining about not feeling well with no obvious kind of medical cause, or even a change in eating habits. In terms of sleep changes, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that teens are averaging 8 to 10 hours of sleep, and pediatricians, of course, are recommending shutting down screens 30 minutes before bedtime, removing all electronics from the bedroom. So we want to notice, parents want to notice difficulty falling asleep within their teens, staying asleep, frequent nightmares, waking up not refreshed, and school performance. If there's increasing of school avoidance, missed days due to anxiety-related illnesses, persistent worry, big shift in grades downward, your teen describing feeling really overwhelmed, an unusual amount of procrastination. And then lastly, final area, I'll talk about mild symptoms of panic without your teen necessarily having a full panic attack. That still very much can be an emerging anxiety disorder. So the things that we think about with panic attacks are rapid heartbeat, sweating, trembling, dizziness, upset tummies, difficulty breathing, chest pains. A lot of teens tell me they feel like they're dying or like they're just going crazy. A sense of numbness or tingling in their arms. And also a very common symptom I see in teens is a sense of derealization. Often teens will talk to me, they feel like they're watching themselves in a movie rather than actually being in the moment.
Those are really great. Rich description gives parents a lot of things to think about. Thank you. Thanks. Well, Jenny is here to share about her journey of being a mom of two teens who have experienced moderate to severe anxiety and all that she's been learning about as she's been supporting her kids for years now. So, Jenny, can you tell us about what's just sort of the overview of what your kids have gone through in relationship to anxiety?
Yeah, as I listen to one, I think we have a lot of triggers or risk factors in our family. There's genetics. There is certainly a family component with my husband, with me. They both witnessed some traumas. I think for my daughter going to as her anxiety took hold and there were some police interactions, that was certainly traumatic for her, for my son, etc. But as I think about it, they were both had showed signs when they were young, but as they matured, I want to say really, I felt like as well, what's now I'm going to forget the term. As they began to mature into tweens, they turned and they started going through those life changes. That's when it really came to be out of control. They could no longer manage. And I became aware in retrospect of just how much they had been juggling their anxiety. And that was the point at which they could no longer go to school or struggled with school, could not balance everything, were having meltdowns in home and there. And in both of their cases, got to the point where it was so debilitating, we did send them to residential treatment, each of them different times, obviously. They've both come home and actually learned a lot about taking ownership and are both forging their own path. And now I think it's just a matter of supporting them in that.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD Santa Cruz, K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with Jenny Shane, the mother of 2 young adult children who have both experienced serious anxiety symptoms since childhood. Also with us is psychologist Sheila Siegel, who's helping us understand more about teen anxiety, how parents can effectively support their kids, treatment approaches, and local resources. This is the second show in our 2-episode series on teens and anxiety, so stay with us to learn more, and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Family Service Agency of the Central Coast for supporting this program. Family Service Agency provides counseling and support for people of all ages facing life crises and challenges. You can reach them at 423-9444 to see if they can help you. Thank you, Family Service Agency of the Central Coast, for supporting KSQD 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. So do you want to say any more, Jenny, about the story of, so you talked about them going to residential, coming back, and coping better. What would you say about their skills since they returned from residential treatment?
They've improved a lot. I think if I can back up a little bit, one of the things that has been most influential for me was an article that was given to me by Elena's therapist, probably when she was 4 or 5. And I've listed it on the resources. It's The Science of Success. And it essentially made the case and said some kids were like dandelions, they were like weeds, they could thrive in any environment, regardless of the parenting. And some kids were more like orchids. In the wrong environment, you got nothing, they died. In the right environment, you had these wonderful gifts. And so I early on sort of embraced that I have orchids. And therefore, I needed to figure out what it was, what environment they needed to be able to thrive. And so by coming to the decision to place them in residential, it was in realizing we could not give them that environment. We could not control enough factors. We could not support them enough. And so we did that. For both of them coming home, it's been an equal part of then very closely looking at what is the environment they each need to thrive. With Elena, I will say we spent a lot of time deciding on the high school she would go to, with her input of what type of size, whether it would be private, whether it had the right feeling, all sorts of factors to make sure it was the right one, and not just I'm in a very high performing school district. It wasn't just that school that was there that we were maybe being pressured to take. I think for Gabe, my son as well, in coming home, it was really key to then, again, identify the high school that he would come into with the right supports, the right type of people, so they could go on.
As you hear, Sheila, as you hear Jenny talk about what she learned from, understanding her kids' anxieties and the kind of environments they need, what would you say it would be important for our listeners to know about anxiety in teens and what some of their needs are?
Yeah, I would say that it's really a matter of degree in lots of ways. In Jenny's case, her kids really very much showed their distress, and it became very, readily apparent that they were in need of resource. A lot of teens in my practice have actually been silent sufferers by minimizing their struggles to others and in their attempt to kind of seem okay. Yet internally, they're exhausted from a lack of coping skills and emotional isolation.
So glad you brought that up because, yeah, there is a big range. And it sounds like your kids, Jenny, kind of made it known pretty early in their lives. Whereas with older teens, it may go under the radar for a long time, is what you're saying, Sheila. Yeah.
And I would say we also then learned from our experience. Elena being the older one, And she needed the intervention when she was younger,
Mhm.
but that made us a whole lot more aware of what was out there, what we could do, what was going on. And so um, we began, I think, looking for it more and asking maybe the right questions and being open to it instead of just saying, oh, you can do that. That's no problem. You can, and I find that often people will look at how competent the teen is and just say, oh, you've got this. Don't worry. You're a great public speaker. And I found that that's actually often counterproductive. All it does is sort of tell that kid you have not heard them. And so I think we, in contrast, have maybe gone the opposite direction because we've been so aware of it. And I think also with my own personal experience with depression, I am very aware of that type of don't placate me, don't just reassure me.
I think you bring up a great point, Jenny, which is the great divide between perhaps someone's capability and their own perception of that. And I'm wondering, Sheila, do you want to speak to that at all as a way that maybe some kids do fly under the radar, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, sometimes anxiety, will show up more in acting out behaviors but very often also it shows up in patterns of avoidance. And teens are rarely able to say, I am anxious, but rather they'll tend to act it out, perhaps with irritability, or they might even attempt to avoid the uncomfortable feelings by procrastinating, which isn't about them not caring. It's very much about them just trying to cope.
Hmm.
So we're seeing, increasing rates of anxiety in teens. And, we have a lot of different stress factors, right? We have culture of achievement. We're in a world that can feel very scary and threatening. Our teens are in school environments where they're having active shooter drills and lockdowns. We're in the middle of a pandemic that's claiming many lives and causing unemployment for millions of families. And we have a 24/7 media loop, right, that's exposing us to so much of what's out there. And then in addition, our teens are in an environment where they're steeped in social media, where their self-esteem is really very much becoming connected to the responses they're getting on their social media posts. So it's really hard for them not to compare their life to what they see others posting on social media.
Hmm.
So that's a
Yeah,
whole lot going on.
that is a lot going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jenny, over the course of parenting these two kids with different but with some similar needs, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've kind of had along the way?
I think I've struggled, and as a family, my husband has had to struggle with s- allowing them to be distressed. You see your child in pain and you want to take it away. And I think I've initially I probably tried to fix things too much. I tried to take away the stressors, find ways around it, and I take the ownership of it to try to make it better. That really didn't help them in the long run. It just made them dependent on me or maybe feel like they couldn't do it on their own. But again, it's really hard to sit with their distress.
Mhm.
And I think in our case, because both of them then did get to the point of extreme behaviors, we were really scared of what would happen if we didn't respond and if we held the line. So I think particularly since my son has come home, that has been the lesson of understanding I can still hold them accountable. It's okay, but it's also okay for them to express their distress and to that I'm not doing anything about it.
So, Jenny, you were referring to really difficult behaviors that got yours and your husband's attention. Would you be willing to talk about what some of those behaviors were?
I'm not going to give you the specifics, but I think, they ended up going into self-harm or potential harm of others. Certainly risky behaviors. I describe it, I think, with my son in particular. He would be like a cornered wild animal when he would snap into it. That at that point, he was not rational. He did not have access to thinking about consequences or any of that. He was just trying to escape that anxiety that was going on. And so, the final thing for him was he basically, defied police officers and their instructions, and oblivious to that. And if I think about it, I'm very lucky that we are white and middle class and where we lived. It could have ended so, much worse.
A quick note for some context on Jenny's statement here. Studies show that half of all people killed by American police had registered disabilities, and a large percentage of those were people with mental illnesses. People with untreated mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed during a police encounter than other civilians. And due to racism in our country, African Americans are at even greater risk. Young Black men with mental illnesses are in the single most at-risk category in the nation for fatal police violence. In the absence of more sophisticated mental health response systems, police are often the first responders to a mental health crisis. Clearly, a more appropriately trained response system is needed to save lives. Back to our interview.
But I agree. And I think, we certainly did have to call the police sometimes. We did call a great resource, again, is Uplift Family Services in the Bay Area, which has a mobile crisis team. And we would use them and call them and say, my child is having a meltdown, is out of control, is maybe doing self-harm behaviors that at this point are probably not life-threatening, but you worry about where they're going because they're working for a reaction and they have lost that grip with rationality. And so those crisis people could either sometimes come by physically and make an assessment and help, and if necessary, hospitalize, or just talk us through it. And so again, having those times where the advice was, you were supposed to call 911 now.
I just want to thank you so much for sharing that, and I know how hard that is to sort of talk about and revisit, and it's so important that you share it. I'm also a volunteer for NAMI parent support groups, and almost every parent that goes through something like that with their kids feels like, they must be not the only ones, but that other people aren't having this experience. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really helpful for them to hear that's not true.
I found myself, particularly in those days, they're really great kids. They're really gentle kids. They're really, and they are. And so again, I go back to that mantra of what is the environment? It's not what's wrong with my child, but what is it that we need to do? And whether they are just in something with too much stimulus, too much of these other things, okay. But it's not that they're bad or that there's anything wrong with them.
Sheila, I'm wondering if you want to speak to that in terms of, those kind of expressions. Are those a form of a panic attack in a sense, those kind of behavioral expressions? And would you want to say anything about that?
Absolutely. For that child, that teen, it truly feels like they're fighting for their life. It is a survival instinct. There is not a thought, there's not a capacity for thought about how is my current reaction or action affecting others. It's just truly, it's no different than someone who thrashes about as they're drowning, just trying to gasp for air. Very similar, very much on a neurological level, on a psychological level. It is truly a survival instinct.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD K-Squid, and this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and this is the second show in our 2-episode series on teens with anxiety. Today I'm here talking with Jenny Shane, the mother of 2 young adult children who both have experienced serious anxiety symptoms. Also with us is local psychologist Sheila Siegel, who's helping us understand more about teen anxiety, how parents can effectively support their teens, treatment approaches, and local resources. I want to remind listeners that all the resources we talk about on this show can be found at ksqd.org/state-of-mind/. Back to our interview. Jenny, what would you consider to be some of your parenting successes? Like, how have you and your family learned to cope or deal better? And what, like, specific tools or practices do you find yourself using?
So the fact that they are both alive and thriving, I think is a huge marker of success. And I think affirms our decisions to have sent them away, actually. Elena will say that residential saved her life. It's hard to hear as a parent because on the one hand, one, that the life was in threat, and two, that I was not the one who was taking care of her. I needed somebody else. But by golly, I'm so grateful. And so I think that's been part of it. I think for us, success has been we have been willing to create a team. We have actually created some really effective teams. As I say, Elena's counselor has been on board since she was 3. And many of the people around that have had connections throughout. And we have also done a good job of they have all talked to one another. So when we've been dealing with the schools or when we've been allowing the schools to talk to our therapists and make those connections. And so we've also been able to take their advice of, no, you need to change what you are doing. You need to back off right now and let us handle it. And so I think that that's a big success. And I take as a success that both of my kids are really close to me and still confide in me and talk to me, and that they're great human beings.
Mm-hmm. What more could you ask for?
Mhm.
Yeah. I am curious if there's been any impacts of the coronavirus and these shelter-in-place orders that, has affected your family and your family's mental health.
Surprisingly, for both kids, they have both said it has lessened their anxiety. So for whatever reason, they have not gotten caught up in worrying about the world and that aspect of it. And their school lives have actually gotten simplified, and this takes away some sources of anxiety. So I think the issues for them at home are more, we're at close quarters, so you can't get away. You can't, for my son, he would do a lot of activities outside the house that are now not available. They're shut down, so those aren't there. And I'd say it's probably my mental health and maybe my husband's that's been the hardest affected by this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I love that little twist. Elena responded similarly when we asked about that. And that is, I think it's just interesting that under certain conditions, what might have been a challenge at one point becomes a strength in another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are there any new ways that you find your family's coping given these conditions?
Doing more gardening, my son, so getting out and doing those sorts of things. We watch some television shows together and sort of make a family time and do that. And I am finding that we are doing some drives and listening to podcasts.
Sheila, as Jenny's talked about, what they've found to be ways that they kind of got through and supported their kids. What would you say is an important parent role, for kids who are experiencing anxiety?
Well, I just very much want to acknowledge that talking about mental illness is not an easy conversation. So it's really important for parents to be able to reach out to their teens in a supportive, non-judgmental, patient manner. Very much the way you have, Jenny, you and your husband. It sounds like you've done a really marvelous job. It can be hard to find. However, ideally choosing a good time for your teen, talking in a private place, definitely not as you're driving the carpool home, and using a loving tone. I think the other thing is for parents to know that they don't have to know it all, nor do they have to do it all. And again, to your point, Jenny, about developing a wonderful team. And it sounds like you've put an interdisciplinary team together, which has,
Mm-hmm.
made a really positive difference in your kids' lives. I think also for parents reassuring their teens that reassuring your teen that you're going to help them and your family to be able to increase the support system by reaching out either to a school counselor, a healthcare provider, a licensed mental health counselor professional. All of those things can make a difference. And often our teens have lots of ideas actually about helpful resources, even though they may be feeling too overwhelmed to access them. And they could really benefit from you encouraging them and supporting them to connect with some of those options.
I would jump in on there and say, I think from our perspective, it's been really important as our kids have gotten help that we have grown along with them and learned, because it's not just their problem, their issue. And we have needed to learn how to change our parenting, how to step back, because I think it's very true. Our anxieties are very much triggered by what they're going through. And I think, my husband probably has more of the anxiety and I have more of the depression. But when they're anxious, then he can go to that anxious place. And so to be able to recognize that and accept that and separate that has been, I think, really important. And as I've looked around with other parents, particularly in residential programs, I think the ones that don't do as well are the ones where the parents and the families don't change and aren't as open to their role.
Jenny, as you're talking, I'm wondering if you'd be willing, I realize we jumped around and talked about a lot of different things, and if you could just talk about the kinds of treatments you did seek, like maybe sequentially for your kids, and what you found to be effective or not.
So I will start with Elena, which was a therapist again at age 3, and then it was just sort of as we needed. It wasn't continuous through there. But the key was this was someone who really got her, that she really trusted. So she was willing to go in and talk with her. And it was through that person that we ended up adding eventually a psychiatrist and considered medication, who went with us to the schools as we began to go through that aspect. In Elena's case, she was pretty young when we realized that she needed therapeutic intervention. So the next step was in a long-term hospitalization, I guess it was called, which was really an assessment, doing a full psychiatric assessment and there's another word for it. I'm going to forget that word too, but the type of assessment that would look into her learning styles and all of those sorts of things. And
would that be a neuropsych evaluation?
There you go.
Okay.
All right. See? And so based on that was also where they were the ones who said, we really think she needs residential at this point. So we did residential, came back. I think the thing that we tried when we came back with her, the thought was that if you've been in residential, it's very hard to go straight back into a regular school. And so they wanted to step down, and she was put into a therapeutic day program where she didn't ever really fit. And so for her, it was okay, but it wasn't great. And we began to then sort of find our way through the public school system and eventually chose a charter school because of the way it was set up, and it was smaller and it met her needs, and then just kept the team on. Family counseling has not been a huge part of that for her, although she's joined in on some with my son and all. With my son, he was much more resistant to therapy early on, but I think a lot of that, he didn't have the trust. He didn't have the own personal buy-in. And I think if the child's not bought in, he was pretty good at resisting doing anything. Same thing, I think, with psychiatry. And so it took a while then where we really sought out a new counselor very specifically, how to do that, how to work with it. We had, while we were home, as things were deteriorating, he was seeing a therapist at school. We had that whole education team. They suggested wraparound services and that we get some in-home coaching. Failed miserably. Again, I think some of that was a little bit too simplistic, or he didn't buy in, and there was just more fought against it. I guess also when Elena came in, they did wraparound services, but again, they didn't get the nuance of my kids. And so they shined them on, and it had no value.
Yeah.
And then it's been now when he's come home, it's just making sure that we maintain the ongoing relationship with the therapist, with the psychiatrist, at times even with the kids' therapist, talking to my therapist or my husband's therapist as needed, so that we're all understanding what we're doing and what we need to work on.
I'm appreciating what you're bringing up, because it makes me want to ask Sheila this question about, some teens are going to benefit greatly from outpatient meaning like once a week going to your therapist, or even twice a week going to your therapist. And some teens are not going to benefit from that. And I'm wondering if you can say something about that, and then what are the options that are available if that's the case?
Sure. I mean, I think as Jenny has so beautifully shared, one size doesn't fit all. While we have lots of different tools, there are so many individual differences and family differences that I think part of this is maintaining creativity and being willing to look at different approaches. So for example, even within outpatient therapy, going to see someone in their office, or in some cases, I will say with a number of teens in my practice, we will do lots of different things. We will take a walk, of course, with appropriate permission from parents, but we'll get out in the community, or we will train my therapy dog, quote unquote, train my therapy dog, right? That'll be a way that we work with some calming skills, or use art therapy. There are some teens who respond beautifully to more movement-based therapy, and there are therapists in town who do a lovely job of that. Or equine therapy, that's another great example, even among outpatient modalities, of another way of helping to really get in there and build trust and an ability to do the work. For kids, though, for whom that outpatient model isn't enough, there certainly are three other levels, if you will, and I think Jenny's referenced them. Intensive outpatient treatment, for example, which is typically about 3 hours a day, several days a week. Locally, we have a program, I think it's called Aspire, and typically it's about a 90-day kind of a involvement there, with then transitioning back, or even concurrent with outpatient work.
A quick clarification here. While it is true that some intensive outpatient programs are 90 days, the local Aspire program that Dr. Sheila mentions here is actually 10 weeks for middle schoolers and 8 weeks for both the high school program and the transition age youth program for 18 to 25-year-olds.
Another level is partial hospitalization, and that's a more intensive outpatient approach, so that teens would go typically 5 days a week, all day, like 9 to 5, but they would spend the night at home and the weekends at home. And then the next level of care is residential, which I think Jenny has spoken very well about, and that, as it suggests, is actually living 24/7 with therapists, as well as often people who create more of a family-like kind of a program. And with residential, the real benefit there is that there is constant feedback there within peer culture, within the therapeutic staff, and an environment that's different than home. And so there are very different kinds of triggers and opportunities, if you will, to work through challenges at a bit of a distance from the home environment.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-Squid, Community Radio for the Monterey Bay. And this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with Jenny Shane, the mother of 2 young adult children who have both experienced serious anxiety symptoms. Also with us is local psychologist Sheila Siegel, who's helping us understand more about teen anxiety, how parents can effectively support their teens, treatment approaches, and local resources. This is the second show in our 2-episode series on teens with anxiety. So if you're interested to hear more from Jenny's daughter, Elena, a teen who has learned to live with and even thrive despite the anxiety she's experienced, check out part 1 in this series on teens with anxiety. You can find that on the State of Mind page on our ksqd.org website. Stay with us to learn more, especially about local resources. We'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Positive Discipline Community Resources for supporting State of Mind. Positive Discipline Community Resources provides relationship-based skill building for parents, teachers, and community members. More information is available at pdcrcc.org. Thank you, Positive Discipline, for supporting community radio, KSQD 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. So, Sheila, we were talking about levels of care, and I'm just wondering if you could say, like, when might a parent be considering a higher level of care? Jenny earlier mentioned feeling that her kids had become unsafe. And I'm wondering, is that the only time that someone might think about that, or would there be other times that would indicate kind of a higher level of care?
Well, that's certainly a key one, right? When your teen isn't able to keep themselves safe, and you are no longer able to keep your teen safe, that's a big one. But also some other signs could be irritability escalating to the point of rages that then could cause harm to others. Or even, I've worked with several teens who, in those escalated states, actually harm themselves quite badly without necessarily intending to. They were just so dysregulated that they couldn't not hurt themselves. Also, when you see an inability to sleep across multiple days, I have worked with some teens struggling with severe anxiety who actually became quite disoriented. And initially, it was thought that they were perhaps suffering from an emerging psychosis, when in fact, actually, they were just horribly, horribly anxious and very dysregulated. And then, the other piece, of course, is for teens who have been struggling without getting help and having a sense that there is no way out, that sadly, a number of teens who struggle with anxiety disorders, particularly those who don't get help, will then make a plan to end their life or perhaps even have an actual suicide attempt. And of course, we need to immediately get them help.
That makes me think that we actually didn't cover one level of care, which is hospitalization. So we talked about the levels leading up to that, but for instance, following a suicide attempt, like you mentioned, many teens will be hospitalized at a psychiatric unit that is geared for children and teens.
Yes.
I think our experience has been that hospitalization has not been as helpful as we thought it might be. That when they got there really wasn't that much treatment going on. It was stabilization, and then say, okay, what's your discharge plan? Who are you going to see? What are you going to do? And so realizing that they really don't have a lot of capability of being able to put things in place and such. And so what we found actually was most helpful, as I mentioned again, the Uplift Family Services that had the mobile crisis team, but they also had a 24-hour up to 24 hours. You could be there 23 hours, 59 minutes for teens that they could hold them there. And that one generally, that was just for teens and young people. And so it was so much more therapeutic. It was not going into, sort of a big psych ward. It was more of that, giving that time for the child to stabilize, be calmed down without some of the traumatizing aspects of hospitalization.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And maybe to make it more specific to Santa Cruz area, we have a different kind of team called MERT, which is a mobile emergency response team, who will also come out similarly. Parents can also inform them if they expect that they might have repeated calls. And they come out with a mental health professional and law enforcement together to address those moments. And we also have Santa Cruz County Behavioral Health Center that can hold teens exactly 23 hours And maybe we'll make sure that those numbers are on our, I'll add those to our resource list as well.
I just want to add, if I may, too, that sometimes, again, to Jenny's point about hospitalization being so traumatizing, sometimes I've had success with helping families to identify a relative or a very close family friend with whom they can have their teen just regroup and take a break. And it never ceases to amaze me how many teens can actually kind of pull themselves together and achieve some level of regulation when they just have a change of scene and different people with whom they're interacting, different patterns of interaction. So that's not appropriate for, a high level of dangerousness, harm to self or harm to another. But as kids are starting to ramp up, it is terrific when we can intervene at that level.
Thank you. That's a great idea. I'm wondering, Jenny, as you were going through this, with your kids struggling and even sending them to residential treatment, did you feel cut off from your parenting friends? And did you feel isolated in that experience?
I did feel isolated. As I think about it, I'm not sure how much was my imagining that they were cutting me off versus them really cutting me off, because I could do the whole dialogue about what a bad parent I must be, what is the common factor with both of my kids, me, and those sorts of things. I think my approach ended up being, also because of my personality, a little bit defiant. And so it was like, I dare you to say something negative about this. And while it came out maybe a little bit belligerently, I was surprised to find then actually how receptive people were, and how often when I would speak about it, that I would hear them then share, oh, we've experienced that too, either directly or a family member or a neighbor. And so the interesting thing has been, the more open I have been about it, the more it has actually been affirmed of how many more people experience the same thing.
Yeah. So that takes a lot of courage. I commend you for that. So I'd like to ask this question, why did you think it was important to come talk about this with, on the show today, Jenny?
Because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about mental health, and that to make the point that one can be mentally ill, I hate that phrase somehow, but to have a mental health issue and still be productive, great members of society. And so it's not a blanket thing that, oh, they're mentally ill. There are lots of us. And I think actually probably most people more or less somewhere or other have some degree of this. And so I think just opening up people's minds and saying it's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to learn about yourself, and how can you then work with that.
And I'll just add one final thought, and that is to not minimize anxiety, to recognize that it's so hard as it is for teens to be able to talk about it, and how important it is to take your teens seriously and to really seek support for them.
In Your Voice segments give you a chance to share a piece of your story in your own voice. Share with us a mental health experience you've had, or you can comment on a previous show, ask a question for an upcoming show, or share a resource that has helped you. This is how it works. You just give us a call at 831-824-4324 and leave a 1 to 3 minute message with your name and your comments or questions. Or you can record a short audio file right on your phone and email that in to us at debra.stateofmind@ksqd.org. And Debra is spelled Debra. Your voice may just become part of one of our future shows. And now, for today's In Your Voice segment, we heard from Lisa, a local parent of a young adult who has struggled with anxiety since they were a teenager.
Hi, my name is Lisa Tabachnik, and I'm the parent of a almost 22-year-old child who has struggled with anxiety since the age of 13. From 13 to 15, I would say they were pretty depressed and anxious. And now the depression has really pretty much gone away, but the anxiety has persisted from time to time, although they've really learned how to deal with it. They tell us that the most important thing that we did as parents was that we took them seriously when they started having these feelings and exhibiting the signs of anxiety, and that then we were really consistent in our response. For us, it was a big surprise because our child went from someone who was exceptionally social and outgoing to having a really high level of social anxiety. And the other thing that worked for us is that we got therapy right away. We did not jump to medication, but through help of our therapist, we worked together with our child to learn strategies, mindfulness, going out in nature, taking walks, things that helped them learn how to calm their own anxiety, talking things through before they happened. I think some cognitive behavioral therapy. And all those things combined over time made a huge difference, so that now at almost 22, and I would say really for the last 4 or 5 years, our child has been able to manage their own anxiety with little to no medication. And my advice for other parents would be to try and keep communication as open as possible, to take their feelings seriously, even if what they are anxious about seems ridiculous to you. Don't obviously say that, but listen, just listen, and try your best not to mirror their anxiety or take up their level of energy around it, but to stay calm while you're listening and try to find them the help that they need, which may be in the form of therapy or may be in a different form. I think everybody's situation is unique. And the best thing to know is that people change and develop, and over time, your child will mature and they'll learn different ways to cope. And I'm just amazed now when I watch my child how well they've learned to take care of themselves when they're feeling anxious and do the things that they know will help them to feel better.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I want to say thank you again to my guests today, Jenny Shane and Dr. Sheila Siegel, and thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. To hear more conversations about mental health and wellness here on California's Central Coast, join me on the first Sunday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. right here on KSQD 90.7 FM. You can also find all the podcast episodes of this show on our ksqd.org website by typing State of Mind in the search bar, and catch any of your favorite programs on KSQD through your home smart speaker just by saying play KSQD on TuneIn. Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzikowski for audio production and to Jennifer Young, who assists with research and outreach. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. To hear your voice on one of our shows, call us at 831-824-4324 to comment on a previous show, ask a question for an upcoming show, or share a resource. Just leave a 1 to 3 minute message with your name and your comments or questions. Upcoming show topics are on forgiveness, Santa Cruz County Mental Health Crisis Services, and Alzheimer's and mental health. This is listener-supported community radio, so that means we want and we need to hear from you. So let us know what you think about this or any of the shows you're hearing here on KSQD. Just send us an email at onair@ksqd.org. This is KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, KSQD, your ink spot on the dial. Stay with us.